Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see you all out here today, and I hope you're having a wonderful afternoon. My name is James William Hurt, but you don't have to keep up with any of that. Please, I want you to call me JW because most everybody always did. Now, a little bit about myself. I was born on January the 6th, 1849, right here in Adair County. My parents were Young Hurt and Susanna Morrison Hurt. Now, in the winter of 1851, just shy of my 3rd birthday, my mother passed away, and my father would later remarry my stepmother, who was also from here in Adair County. She was a young lady by the name of Mary Montgomery. Now, between my father, my mother, and stepmother, I had 2 sisters, 3 half-sisters, and 4 half-brothers. Several of my siblings would grow up to become pretty prominent here in the local community, mostly for their practices in law. Now, the one you've probably heard the most about is my little brother Rollin. He's buried right over the hill here. And he was a judge, and in fact, at one point, he even served on the Kentucky Supreme Court. And his son Ralph was actually a pretty prominent attorney, and he practiced law right here in Columbia. But now all that was after my time. My father was a lawman as well. He served as sheriff of Adair County for several years, and I actually served as one of his deputies later in his term. Now, I can be the first to tell you I was not always the most law-abiding of citizens per se, but to get more into that, I have to know, how many of you have ever heard the name John Hunt Morgan? Now, for those of you who don't know who John Hunt Morgan was, I'll go on and let you know you won't find him anywhere here. John Hunt Morgan was a general in the Confederate Army during the American Civil War. In the summer of 1863, General Morgan and his cavalry came through this part of the country, and they camped right over on some property here on the other end of town. And the property they were camped on actually joined my father's farm. Now, I was 14 years old that summer, and I had a couple of friends, little buddies of mine that I run around with. They were brothers. Their names were George and Rue. Well, we were really taken by this General Morgan. We'd never seen anybody like him. He was a big strapping fella and long dark hair, really clean cut, well manicured, and he was a little high on himself, to be perfectly honest. That's a story for another time. But him and his soldiers come riding into town in their nice fancy uniforms and their shiny boots, and all these horses they come riding into town on, you all, they were some of the most beautiful animals I'd ever seen. There was one in particular that caught my attention. She was a great big strong looking roan colored mare. Now, for those of you who don't know what roan is, it's a very dark gray. It's almost, if it weren't for that little bit of gray, it'd be black. But she was just a beautiful animal. There was this little bald-faced sorrel horse that George took a liking to. And we sat and drooled over these horses for 2 or 3 days now. And over where these soldiers and such were camped, it was a very hot time of the year, and that summer was particularly hot itself. Now, in the middle of the day, hottest part of the day, these soldiers would try to find some shade, a little relief from the heat, and they had their horses tethered up on a big long tether line right there a few yards off from the edge of the woods where they were camped. Well, me and George had come up with this idea as to how we were going to come about getting these horses, and we thought we could sneak up and we could get these horses away from the other ones. Now, what played to our advantage is Rue was not in any way, shape, or form interested in these horses, but he was not interested either in sitting at home and missing out on our little excursion, so he was going to be our lookout. Well, to our great surprise, the first half of our plan worked. We were actually able to get up and get these horses away from the others. We got headed down off of Cedar Cliff there on Pettit's Fork, down this old beaten path that everybody around here called the Old Rocky Road. At least that's what we called it. Now, when you get so far down, it kind of runs up alongside of a creek bed there, and in all of our excitement, none of us ever thought that any of these soldiers might be using this creek for a relief from the hot weather or a water source of any kind. We got going down through there, and sure enough, when we got down to the part that ran right up alongside this creek, about 10 or 12 of these soldiers came up off the bank. And I think, honestly, we surprised them about as much as they surprised us. But it didn't take them long to realize that these horses that we had hold of was theirs. So they come after us and we took off. We got on down and we got to a part where the woods kind of got a little thicker. And we thought it would be to our advantage to duck off into the woods. Well, that backfired because all that did was slow us down. Well, these soldiers were able to fan out and start trying to corral the horses, and well, us too. And when we seen that we wasn't going to get away, we actually just let the horses go and took off. If these soldiers pursued us at all, or if they were just fine with getting their horses back, I don't know, and we weren't going to stick around and find out. We kept on going. We went way on over to the other side of my father's farm, into the woods on the north end, and we stayed hunkered down in them woods way up in the evening till we knew these soldiers or nobody else was looking for us. Now for a while thereafter, I was under the impression that between the three of us and these soldiers and the two horses, if you want to throw them into it, had never seen or heard of nothing of what went on. But I later came to find out that my little brother Rollin, who I mentioned a few minutes ago, he was about 3 going on 4 years old at the time. He watched the whole thing happen from the second floor window of our father's house. And it was a memory that he relived vividly the rest of his life, and whenever he got the chance, he was happy to tell you this story. Now, if any of y'all have ever got to hear him tell it or have heard of him telling it, if you didn't believe him, I'm here to tell you that it actually happened. Now, as Rollin got a little older, the story might have got longer and might have had a little more action added to it, but I can't be responsible for that part. I can just tell you that it happened. Now, but later on in my life, a few years later, when I got a little older and wiser and decided I would leave my career of horse thievery in the past, as I alluded to, I was served as a sheriff's deputy under my father in the later part of his time as sheriff. Actually, he was sheriff at the time when he passed away. That was in 1871. Now, the year before that, 1870, December of that year is when I married my wife, Margaret. Margaret Ann Powell was her maiden name. She was the daughter of Oscar Powell and Martha Craig Powell, who was Oscar's second wife. Now, Margaret and I and our children, we were members of the Methodist Church, and we had 6 children. They were Jerome, Charlie, Lucian, Henry, Lena, and Robert. Now, later on in my years, I went on and followed in my father's footsteps and served as sheriff of Adair County myself on 2 separate occasions. The first time in 1892, I served for 2 years that time. A few years later, 1897, I served for a 4-year term. Now, unfortunately, when I got a little later in age, in my late 50s and early 60s, I started to experience some health problems, mostly stomach issues, indigestion, dysentery, things like that were common in that time. At first, it wasn't very much of a problem. It was pretty manageable. But as things tend to do with stuff like that, as I got older, the problem got worse. By the time I got to my early 60s, I would have days where I was just, for days at a time, I was in constant pain. And it got less and less manageable. And the spring of 1913 is when it got at its worst. I reached a point where I couldn't even get out of bed. I was so weak, so tired, and so much pain. Several doctors from here in town and the surrounding area came to offer me some kind of help, whether it was medicine or just some kind of treatment that they thought might bring me a little relief from my pain, and nothing ever worked. And it went on, and it didn't take us long to figure out that the end was coming pretty quick for me. And so I laid there at the house, unable to really do anything, just miserable, for about 3 weeks, better part of a month. And on April the 10th, it was way late up in the afternoon of that year, 1913. That's when the suffering finally ended for me. And I was there at home with Margaret and the children, and several of my brothers and sisters were there, because like I said, it wasn't unexpected that we were expecting that to happen. And I was 64 years of age when I passed away. And I'll focus on that for just a minute. Now, to you all here today, 64 may not seem that old. Well, I can look around at some of my neighbors here, and they hit 64 and just kept on going, didn't even slow them down. Now, in my time, 64, you were creeping up on borrowed time. You were an old man. And there's no better way of explaining that than for you to look at the lives of my children. Out of my 6 children that me and Margaret had, none of my sons ever saw the age of 60. Only 2 of my kids even went on to raise families of their own. Our oldest son, Jerome, he never married. He stayed pretty active here in the community, though. He served as a sheriff's deputy on a couple of occasions, and he actually went on to serve as mayor of Columbia. He was actually mayor of Columbia at the time he passed away. Now, probably the saddest story of me and Margaret's life together has to do with our second son, Charlie. The reason is, there's really no story to tell there. You see, Charlie only lived to be about 3.5 weeks old. Now, that was a very hard time for us, very sad time, as it is for anyone, I'm sure, who loses a child. But again, alluding back to the times we were living in, especially here in a rural community like where we're at, modern medicine was not plentiful. And to lose a child at a very young age, or even at an infant age like Charlie, that was not uncommon. And sadly, it was actually very common in that time. Our third son, Lucian, he actually served as a sheriff's deputy under me during my second time. He also taught school here in Adair County. He didn't marry until later in life, after I had done passed away. He moved over to Liberty for a little while and married a young lady he'd met over there. But they weren't married very long. After a few months, she fell ill and passed away very suddenly. It wasn't but a couple months later that Lucian fell ill, and he would end up passing away from that illness. Now, our son Henry married a young lady from here in Adair County by the name of Nanny Lee Butler. Henry and Nanny Lee, when they were married, moved out to Colorado, and Henry took up trade in carpentry, and they would spend the rest of their life out there. Our daughter Lena, she married a young man by the name of Ralph Moss. Ralph was from Georgia. And after they were married, they settled in Birmingham, Alabama. They had 2 sons. Both of their sons grew up to have very successful careers in the United States military. Our youngest son, Robert, he married a young lady also here locally. Her name was Mary Lou McCaffrey. They would go on to have 4 children. And Robert, like his brother Henry, took up trade in woodworking, lumber, carpentry, such as that. But Robert's job kept that family relocating quite a bit. Most of the time it was here, not too far away. At one point they did move as far away as Pennsylvania, but that didn't last very long, and they would move back and relocate in Louisville. And now Robert was living under, by all accounts, a clean bill of health until one day he was at work at the lumber yard he worked at in Louisville, and without any warning he just collapsed and sadly passed away before any help could get to him. Now, of course, and as you can see here, Margaret, my wife, passed away in 1937. And that was a particularly difficult time for our daughter. Obviously, she just lost her mother. But you see, in the last few years of Margaret's life, she'd actually moved down to Birmingham as her health got worse to live with Lena and Ralph so that Lena could care for her. And when she passed away, Lena accompanied her mother's remains back here to the funeral home for the funeral and to be buried here in the cemetery here next to me. And Ralph stayed behind in Birmingham. Well, upon arriving here to the funeral home, Lena received word that her husband Ralph had suffered a massive heart attack and passed away while she was en route to Kentucky. So she had to go on and see to all the arrangements, the funeral, the burial, and everything else. And as soon as that was taken care of, she had to turn right around as quick as she could get back to Birmingham and do the same for her husband. And so that was a really hard time for her. And I really hate that our little girl had to go through that. But you know, you all, as the old saying will go, and I'm sure it still is true to you all today, the most unpredictable part of life is life itself. Now, 4 of our children are here at the cemetery with us. Lucian, Jerome, Robert, and his wife Mary Lou. They're buried right here alongside me and their mother. Henry and Nanny Lee, like I said, they lived in Colorado, but they had it worked out that when they passed away, they'd be brought back here to be buried in their hometown. And they're just a few rows back here, a little over towards the middle of the cemetery from us. Charlie, our son that we lost when he was a little baby, he's actually buried over at the Hurt Cemetery with my mother and father. And Lena, of course, is buried with her husband Ralph, their 2 boys, and some of their family at Elmwood Cemetery. Of course, that's in Birmingham. Now, with all that being said, I'm going to go on and wrap this up and quit rambling, because you all might have someone else here you want to go pay respects to or visit with. And there's plenty of my neighbors here you could learn plenty from, and I encourage each and every one of you to do so. But I have enjoyed your visit today, and I've enjoyed getting to talk to you, and I'm glad you came out, and you all feel more than welcome to come back and visit us anytime you want. So God bless each and every one of you, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you all so much.